The strawberry milk left a faint pink ring on the table beside the infirmary bed, and I stared at it for a long time after Theo left. He had gone without ceremony, without asking if I was all right, without requiring me to perform recovery for his benefit. He simply packed his homework into his bag at some point while I was looking out the window, said, "Eat something before 6th period," and walked out. The nurse came in 20 minutes later and looked at the empty carton, and then at me with the particular expression of adults who have noticed something they don't quite know how to name. "Friend of yours?" she said, nodding at the door. "No," I said. And then, because it didn't feel entirely accurate, "Not yet." She gave me a biscuit from her desk drawer and sent me back to class. I didn't speak to Theo again for 3 days. Not because anything had soured between us. There was nothing between us yet to sour, but because I didn't know how to approach the exchange. I was 14 and had recently relocated from a city where I had spent 4 years learning to be invisible, and the mechanisms of ordinary social exchange still felt, to me, like a foreign language I was studying from a textbook rather than living inside. I knew the grammar. I stumbled on the idioms. I could not reliably predict when a sentence would land wrong. What I understood very clearly, however, was observation. I had been watching people since I was old enough to understand that understanding people was a survival skill. I watched Theo the way I watched everything, carefully, from a slight distance, cataloging detail. He sat 3 rows in front of me in mathematics and had the habit of tapping his pen against his knee when a problem was interesting rather than when it was difficult, which was the inverse of most people and told me something about the quality of his attention. He ate lunch alone twice a week, not because he lacked the social architecture for company but because he appeared to actively prefer solitude at intervals, the way some people need silence between pieces of music to hear each one properly. He was on the skateboarding circuit that wound through the back of the school grounds after hours, which was technically prohibited and universally tolerated, and he was good at it in the way of people who are good at things quietly, without requiring an audience. He did not look at me during those 3 days. This was also information. On the 4th day, I arrived at homeroom to find a small carton of strawberry milk sitting in the center of my desk. Same brand. Same cheapest available cheapness. No note. I sat down. I looked at it. I looked at the back of Theo's head 3 rows forward, where he was already doing something in his notebook with complete apparent absorption. I opened the milk and drank it. He never turned around. But I saw, in the slight adjustment of his posture, the smallest loosening of some held tension across his shoulders, the involuntary tell of a person who has been waiting without admitting to themselves that they were waiting. I filed this information away carefully. This became our first language. Not words. We were not yet at words. We're still in the longer and more honest grammar of gesture and presence. But the milk, appearing on my desk 2 or 3 times a week with the regularity of something intentional. Never acknowledged. Never made into something that required a response from me. It just appeared, the way a light appears in a window across a dark street, not demanding to be noticed, but there for you if you needed it. I did not tell my mother about Theo. This was instinctive rather than calculated. I had learned early that the things I valued had a tendency to become leverage in Claudette's hands. She had a gift for identifying what mattered to me and then applying pressure precisely there, not always maliciously, sometimes with what she genuinely believed was my best interest in mind, but consistently enough that I had developed the habit of keeping my interior life in a separate compartment from anything she could access. It was not lying, exactly. It was architecture. The self I showed my mother was a load-bearing structure, functional and without unnecessary ornament. The self that drank strawberry milk from a near stranger's desk and felt something complicated about the warmth of the gesture, that self lived somewhere my mother's hands couldn't reach. November came. The Paris cold arrived with a specific gray commitment it has in that city, not violent like northern cold but persistent, oceanic, the kind that settles into the bones rather than assaulting the skin. I had a winter coat that was too thin because my mother had bought it 2 sizes too large the previous year with the instruction that I would grow into it, which I had, exactly, which meant it now fit correctly but offered no surplus warmth. I wore 2 sweaters underneath and still walked to school with my shoulders drawn up around my ears. On the 3rd week of November, I arrived at school to find not strawberry milk on my desk but a small paper bag. Inside was a pair of hand warmers, the disposable kind you crack open and shake, and a note, the first note, which said only, "These last about 8 hours. More than enough for the walk home." I held the note for a long time. It was not the hand warmers that undid me, though they were warm and necessary, and I used them gratefully all day, pressing them between my palms during lessons with the private pleasure of something that is exactly what you needed before you knew to ask for it. What undid me was the specificity. He had not given me a scarf, which would have been visible, wearable, a gesture requiring acknowledgement. He had given me something for the walk home, meaning he had noticed the walk home, had clocked the direction I went and the coat I wore and the particular hunched posture of someone fighting cold they aren't adequately dressed for, and had found the most private, practical, unremarkable way to address it. No performance. No requirement of gratitude. Just, "I saw that you were cold. Here." I was 14 and I had been sent to the basement for crying, and I had been told I was an investment, and I had been kept at the margins of my father's life like a footnote in someone else's story. And here was a boy I barely knew who had noticed the temperature of my walk home. I did not cry. I was very practiced at not crying in places where someone might see, but I kept the note. I folded it very small and put it in the inside pocket of my notebook, the one with the small metal clasp that no one else ever opened, where I kept the things that were only for me. I have it still. We stood there for a long time in the cold, and neither of us said the things that needed to be said, and this silence would cost us years. The Seine moved below us with its indifferent, ancient patience, catching the city lights and breaking them into long, trembling columns on the black water. I watched the light dissolve and reassemble and dissolve again, and I thought about how a river never holds its shape, never commits to any particular reflection, just receives whatever falls on it and carries it away. I had spent 3 years trying to hold a shape for Renaud, trying to be the reflection he needed on any given day. I was beginning to understand what this had cost me. Theo sat on the stone railing with one leg hanging over the water and one foot on the pavement, his coat collar turned up against the November wind, and he was perfectly still in the way he had always been still, the way of people who have learned that their own presence is enough. He did not ask me what I was thinking. He did not offer commentary on what I had just witnessed. He did not do the thing that most people would have done, which is to begin immediately filling the silence with the words they themselves needed to say rather than the ones you needed to hear. He simply sat beside me in the dark and let the night be what it was. At some point the cold became serious and I started shaking, and he took off his coat without a word and put it around my shoulders, which left him in only his sweater, and when I started to protest he gave me one look, a single gray-eyed look that communicated with complete economy that this was not a subject open for discussion, and I stopped protesting. I was 19 years old and I was wearing the coat of a boy who had been sitting beside me in one form or another for 5 years, and I had champagne drying on the cuff of my dress, and somewhere behind me in an apartment on Isle St. Louis a boy was explaining to a roomful of people why the scene I had just created was an overreaction, and I stood on a bridge in Paris and understood, with the specific totality of a person who has finally stopped arguing with the evidence, that I did not know how to recognize love when it was real. I had only ever known its counterfeits. What happened next is something I have returned to many times, examining it from different angles the way you rotate a stone in your hand looking for what gives it its weight. Theo shifted on the railing and looked at me, not the sideways observational glance he used for the world in general, but directly, fully, the way he almost never looked at anyone. The lamplight was behind him and I could not read his expression with precision, but I could feel the quality of the moment change in the way that the air changes before weather. He opened his mouth, and then his phone rang. It was his mother, calling with a particular frequency that only parents achieve, the frequency that cuts through every other thing because it carries in it the whole architecture of obligation and love and history. He looked at the screen. He looked at me. Something passed through his face that I was not equipped, at 19, to correctly interpret. I would not have the vocabulary for it until much later, until I had become a person who had learned to read the things people do not say with the same attention I gave to the things they do. He answered the phone. He spoke briefly, in the low and even tone he used with his family, the tone that softened the deliberate economy of his ordinary speech into something more giving. I watched the Seine and tried not to listen, and after a few minutes he ended the call and slid off the railing and stood beside me. "I have to go," he said. "I know," I said. "Are you going to be all right?" I looked at the water. "Yes," I said, which was true in the sense that I would continue to function, which was not true in any deeper sense at all. He stood there for a moment. I could feel him standing there, the specific weight of his particular silence, the held quality of it, like a sentence that has been started and then reconsidered. Then he said, quietly, almost carefully, "Elise." I turned and looked at him. He handed me his coat properly, not the draping over the shoulders but an actual giving, guiding my arms into the sleeves, which meant he was close enough that I could see clearly the particular expression on his face, the one that I still lacked the language to name. His hands adjusted the collar. They were very careful, very deliberate hands. "Take the metro," he said. "Don't walk." "I know," I said. "Eat something when you get home." "I know," I said. He held my gaze for one moment longer than the situation required. Then he turned and walked away down the bridge, his sweater entirely insufficient for the November night, his hands in his pockets, his footsteps even and unhurried on the stone, and I watched him until the lamplight made him small and then made him nothing. I stood alone on the Pont de la Tournelle in his coat, which smelled of wood smoke and something clean, and the river moved below me with all its ancient and untroubled patience, and I had the peculiar sensation of having been standing at the edge of something without knowing what it was, and then watching the moment close quietly behind someone else's retreating back. I did not understand, standing there at 19, what had nearly happened on that bridge. I would understand it at 26 and 30, and even now, and the understanding would arrive each time with a particular quality of grief that belongs to the things we almost had. Not sharp, not clean, but slow and spreading and very difficult to stop once it starts. I pulled his coat tighter around myself. I took the metro home. I ate nothing. Behind me, in the party, Renaud had not yet noticed I was gone. I know this because I checked. One backward glance through the glass door of the building before I turned and followed Theo down the pavement, and Renaud was still exactly where I had left him, his head still thrown back in that same laugh, his hand still on that same arm, entirely undisturbed by my absence, which told me everything I needed to know about the precise dimensions of the space I occupied in his life. Not a wound. Not even a gap. Just a slight rearrangement of the air. I had given 5 years to a man for whom my disappearance registered as atmosphere. The creperie was 3 streets over, small and warmly lit, the kind of place that has been in the same location for 40 years and has accumulated on its walls a particular density of other people's evenings. We sat at a table near the window and the waiter brought menus and Theo ordered a coffee and looked at me across the table with that frank, unhurried attention of his. "Tell me what happened," he said. I told him. Not the dramatic version, not the version shaped for maximum sympathy, but the factual version, the way I gave case histories. Chronological, precise, stripped of the editorializing that transforms events into narratives designed to produce a particular response. Julien's words in the kitchen. Renaud's laugh. The specific quality of his irritation when he saw me arrive late. The way he had looked at me like an inconvenience while performing generosity for everyone else in the room. Theo listened the way he always listened, without interrupting, without rushing toward conclusions, without the small nodding urgency of people who are waiting for you to finish so they can say the thing they have already decided to say. He just received it. Let it settle. Considered it properly. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How long have you known that something was wrong?" The question landed differently than I expected. Not "what are you going to do" or "I told you so" or any of the other responses I had been half-braced for. Instead, the question that went directly to the interior mechanism of the thing, the one that required the most honest answer. I looked at the candle on the table. "A long time," I said. "How long?" "Probably from the beginning," I said. "I just didn't know what it was I was sensing." He nodded, slowly, the way he nodded when something confirmed rather than surprised him. "You have always been better at diagnosing other people than yourself," he said. It was not a criticism. It was delivered with the same even-handedness he applied to everything. the tone of a person making an observation about the weather rather than a judgment about character. But it landed precisely because it was accurate, and we both knew it was accurate, and the accuracy of it had the particular sting of things that are true without being cruel. I was 3 years deep into a medical residency. I could read a patient's suppressed pain in the set of their jaw, could hear in the specific cadence of their breathing the thing they were afraid to name, could locate the invisible damage beneath the surface presentation. And I had been living, for 5 years, inside a relationship whose damage I had refused to correctly identify because identification would require action, and action would require believing that I deserved something better, and that belief was the one thing my childhood had most systematically dismantled. The crepes arrived. Mine was buckwheat with ham and a fried egg, which I had ordered without thinking and which was exactly what I needed, and I ate it with the focused attention of someone who has not realized until this moment how hungry they have been. Theo watched me eat with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose primary goal for the evening had been achieved. "You ran here," I said, between bites. "I walked quickly," he said. "You ran," I said. "Your breathing was different when you arrived. You'd been running." He looked at me for a moment. That slight, involuntary adjustment of his expression that was the closest he came to being caught. 18 minutes from the 6 a.m., I said. "That's running." "You were upset," he said simply. "I send you 2 words at 11 at night and you run across half of Paris," I said. "Yes," he said, with complete equanimity, as if this were an entirely proportionate response to the stimulus, as if there were no other logical conclusion to the equation of person I care about plus distress equals immediate movement. I looked at him across the table in the warm yellow light of the creperie, and I had the sensation that I had been having with increasing frequency over these 6 weeks of reacquaintance. The sensation of seeing something clearly that I had been looking at for years without registering. The way an image resolves when you finally find the correct focal distance. Not new information. The same information, suddenly legible. He had always run. That was the truth of it. He had always already been running before I finished the sentence, before I even knew I needed him to. At 14, across a school courtyard. At 19, to a bridge over the Seine. At 28, across the 6th arrondissement at 11 at night, in a coat he was still adjusting when he arrived, because 2 words on a screen had told him that I needed him and needing him was, apparently, sufficient reason. And I had spent 5 years with a man who had not noticed I had left his party. The disproportion of this was suddenly so stark, so absolute, so obvious in the candlelight of a small creperie in November that I felt something crack open in my chest with a quiet, irreversible sound, the way ice sounds when it shifts in spring, not a breaking but a beginning. I set down my fork. "Theo," I said. He looked at me, steady, unhurried, entirely present in the way he was always entirely present. "Why did you come back to Paris?" A stillness moved through him. Not the comfortable stillness of his ordinary quiet, but something more deliberate, more held. The stillness of a person standing at the edge of a decision they have been approaching for a long time. He looked at the candle. "London stopped feeling necessary," he said carefully. "And Paris did?" He looked up at me then. That direct, full-faced attention that he rationed carefully and only ever directed at things that genuinely mattered to him. "You stopped responding to messages 5 years ago," he said. "And then you started again." And he stopped, chose his next words with the precision he applied to everything. I thought it meant something might have changed. The candle moved between us in some small current of air. Outside the window, Paris continued its ancient, indifferent business, and I sat very still in my chair and understood that the man across from me had rearranged the geography of his life on the basis of a reopened line of communication, and had said nothing about it, and had simply appeared on the pavement outside my hospital in the rain, without an umbrella because he had given it away, and had waited. I thought about the basement, the closed door, the years of learning to want less, take less, expect less, make less noise. I thought about 2 words in a text message and 18 minutes of running. "I should tell you something," I said. "Okay," he said. "I'm not entirely sure what I'm doing yet," I said. "I've just ended something, or I'm ending something, and I don't know with precision where I am or what I need. I want to be honest about that." "I know," he said. And I don't want to confuse proximity for love, I said. I've done that before. I don't want to do it again. He was quiet for a moment. Then, with a care that was characteristic of him, choosing the sentence with the exactness of a surgeon selecting the correct instrument. I know the difference, he said. I've known the difference for a very long time. The candle moved again. I picked up my fork. I finished my crepe. And I did not ask him what he meant, because I was beginning to understand that some answers require you to be ready before they can be received, and I was not ready yet, and he, being entirely himself, already knew this and was content to wait. A beginning. This is the word I kept returning to in the days that followed. Not a continuation, not a resolution, not the conclusion of something long and difficult, though it was also all of those things, but a beginning, with everything that word contains. The specific terror of new ground underfoot, the unfamiliar weight of hope held without apology, the strangeness of waking up and not immediately calculating how much of yourself you are permitted to want today. We had dinner at a small restaurant on Rue Lepic that Theo had chosen with his characteristic quiet thoroughness, a place that had no mirrors and no background music engineered for atmosphere, just warm light and honest food and tables far enough apart that the conversation belonged only to the two people having it. He had made the reservation 3 days earlier. I understood, when I saw the table, that he had been planning this for longer than 11 days. He had been planning this with the patient, private exactness of someone who does not announce intentions until the conditions are correct. I sat across from him and felt the strangeness of being in a restaurant with Theo as something other than a friend. The coordinates were the same, his face, his hands, the deliberate way he read a menu, but the context had shifted in some fundamental way, the way a familiar room looks different when you stand in it after a long absence. The same proportions, altered light. He had ordered a burgundy before I arrived and poured a glass for me without asking, which was such a precise and ordinary piece of knowing me. I had been drinking the same burgundy since I was 22. He had been the one to recommend it, that I sat with a glass in my hand and felt the full accumulated weight of all the years of his attention. Years during which I had accepted each individual gesture as a small, isolated kindness rather than reading them collectively as what they were, a sustained and faithful declaration, made in the only language he trusted, which was not words but acts. You were going to give a speech, I said. He looked up. A faint shift at the corner of his mouth. I was, he said. Tell me, I said. He considered this, with a long pause that meant he was deciding how much truth the moment could hold. I had been practicing it since London, he said. Various versions. The first version I wrote on a train somewhere between Paddington and Bristol, approximately 3 years ago. It was too long and too formal and read like a legal document more than a declaration of feeling, which I recognized even at the time as a problem. How many versions? I asked. Several, he said. The last one was considerably shorter. What did it say? He looked at me across the table in the warm light. It said, he began, and then he stopped, and I understood he was translating from something private into something speakable, crossing the distance between the interior version and the one that could survive exposure to air. It said that I had spent a significant portion of my life being grateful that you existed, and a significant portion being afraid that I had waited too long, and that if I was being given another moment, I did not intend to waste it by being careful. The restaurant moved quietly around us. That's not too long at all, I said. No, he said. The editing helped. I looked at the burgundy in my glass. The same burgundy he had ordered for me the first time, when I was 22 and furious about something I no longer remember, and he had simply placed a glass in front of me and said try this, and it had been, without question, exactly what I needed. The cumulative weight of this, of all the times he had known without being told, all the times he had appeared without being summoned, all the years of strawberry milk and hand warmers and books left without signatures. It settled on me not as a revelation, because I had been slowly understanding it for weeks, but as a ratification. A thing confirmed rather than discovered. After dinner we walked. This was not planned. It was simply what happened when neither of us was ready for the evening to resolve. Paris does this, provides itself as a space for the unfinished, the long bridges and the lit embankments and the streets that turn unexpectedly into other streets and allow you to walk further than you intended without noticing. We went along the river. The October air was cold and direct, and Theo walked close enough that our arms touched, which was new and not new, which was the texture of everything between us in those first days. The familiar made suddenly intimate by the removal of the pretense that kept it merely familiar. We stopped at a point along the quay where the city arranged itself, across the water, into its most deliberate beauty. The illuminated towers, the moving black surface of the river, the particular quality of Parisian light that has been painted and written about so many times that seeing it in person carries the strange doubled quality of recognition and experience occurring simultaneously. He reached into his coat pocket. He produced a small box. Not ostentatious. Not the kind of box designed to produce a particular response by its own drama. A simple, dark box, held in his hand with the matter-of-fact ease of someone who has carried it for long enough that it no longer frightens him. "I had the speech," he said, "and the restaurant, and now the river." I appear to have recreated, by accident, all the components of a proposal. "It wasn't entirely by accident," I said. "No," he admitted. He opened the box. Inside was a ring set with a single stone the deep color of a winter sky at 4 in the afternoon. Not quite blue, not quite gray, the precise shade of the light that had been falling across Paris on the day he walked back into my life, standing in the rain outside the hospital without an umbrella. "I've been looking for that color for a long time," he said quietly. I knew it when I saw it. I understood that he was not speaking only about the stone. I understood, with complete and unambiguous clarity, standing on the embankment in October with the river moving below and the city doing its ancient indifferent beautiful thing on all sides, that this man had been looking for ways to give me precise and accurate things for 16 years. Not grand things. Not things designed to impress or to demonstrate his own generosity or to purchase my admiration. Things that were accurate. The right brand of milk. The right temperature of hand warmers. The right color of a ring that matched the light on the day he found me again. He had never wanted to give me the wrong thing. He had gone back for the perfect flowers. He had rearranged the geography of his life on 2 words in a text message. He had stood on a perimeter in the dust and said, without drama, without negotiation, "I will find her." I took the ring from the box. I put it on my own hand, which made him exhale. A single, quiet breath. The breath of someone who has been holding something carefully for a very long time and has finally, at the correct moment, been permitted to set it down. "Tomorrow morning," I said. "The Mary." "Tomorrow morning," he said. I looked at the ring on my hand. Then I looked at him, the particular gray of his eyes in the lamplight, the quality of his stillness that I had known since I was 14 years old and had spent years failing to read correctly, and would now spend the rest of my life grateful to be close enough to see. "The speech would have been good," I said. "The editing helped," he said again. I laughed. He smiled, the real one, the one he kept for moments when he was not monitoring how much of himself was showing. We stood on the quay with the river below and the city around us and the ring on my hand catching the light, and the cold came in off the water and neither of us moved, because there was nothing left that needed doing or saying or managing or performing, because we were standing inside something real, and real things do not require any maintenance other than the continued choosing of them. I leaned into his shoulder. His arm came around me without any deliberation at all, immediately, the way a door opens when you have the right key. Behind us, Paris continued. Below us, the river carried on carrying everything forward, the way it always had, indifferent and ancient and quietly magnificent. And I stood in the October night with my hand in his and felt, for the first time in my life, that I was not borrowing the light. The specific, quiet, almost frightening sensation of having arrived somewhere true. I lay in the hospital bed after he left, and I listened to the particular silence of a hospital at 2 in the morning, which is not actually silence at all but a different register of sound, the low mechanical breathing of equipment in distant rooms, the muted footsteps of the night staff, the occasional murmur of a voice too far away to resolve into words. I had spent years on the other side of the silence, the working side, the side where you move through it with purpose and the sounds are information rather than atmosphere. Lying inside it, as a patient, I understood it differently. It was the sound of the building holding itself together around the fragile and temporary fact of human bodies. I was 30 years old and I had a broken rib and a contusion the size of a large hand across my left side and a mild concussion that made the ceiling shift slightly when I moved my head too quickly, and I had never in my life felt more precisely located in time and space. This is what extremity does. It burns away the speculative and leaves only the actual. I thought about the mountain moving. I had been in medicine long enough to understand the physiology of terror, the adrenal cascade, the narrowing of peripheral vision, the way time restructures itself in crisis into something granular and non-linear, but knowing the mechanism had not prepared me for the experience of it. In the 4 hours under the collapsed structure, there had been a period, perhaps 30 minutes, perhaps longer, during which I had understood with complete biological clarity that I might not come out. Not as a dramatic thought, not as the kind of fear that announces itself loudly and requires management. As a quiet, factual assessment, delivered by some very old and honest part of the nervous system. You may not come out. In those 30 minutes, I had thought about 3 things. The first was my patient, the woman with the injured leg and the shallow breathing, and whether the stabilization I had managed before the second collapse would hold long enough for someone else to reach her. She had survived, I learned later. Her name was Marguerite. She sent me a card from the rehabilitation facility 6 weeks after the landslide, a simple card with a painting of mountain wildflowers on the front, and inside in careful handwriting, the young doctor with the steady hands. Thank you for not letting go. The second thing I thought about was my mother. Not with anger, not with a residue of injury, but with something more complicated and more honest. A kind of sorrow for both of us, for the woman she had been and the child I had been, for the specific damage that passes between people who love each other badly because no one taught them how to love well. I did not resolve anything in those 30 minutes. But I thought about her with a completeness I had not previously managed, which is perhaps what proximity to death permits, the full picture, without the self-protective editing. The third thing was Theo. I thought about him with the same clarity with which I had thought about Marguerite's breathing and my mother's face. Factually, directly, without the carefully maintained ambiguity that had characterized so much of my interior life. I thought, he is driving here right now. I did not know this for certain. But I knew it the way I knew certain things about patients before the test results confirmed them, by the accumulation of evidence, by pattern, by the specific reliable grammar of who he was. He was driving here right now because this was what he did. This was what he had always done. He moved toward me when I needed him before I had finished forming the need. And I thought, in that darkness under that rubble with my ribs pressing wrong against my lungs, I have not told him enough times that I know this about him. I have not said it with sufficient directness and frequency. I have accepted his care the way I accepted the strawberry milk at 14, gratefully, quietly, without fully naming what I was being given. I made a decision under that mountain. Not a dramatic decision, not the kind that resolves itself in a single transformative moment. A quiet decision, the kind that settles into the body rather than the mind. I would stop being careful with the truth of what I felt. I had been careful my entire life. I had learned careful the way some children learn not to cry, as a survival strategy, as a way of making yourself less of a target, less of an inconvenience, less of a thing that could be sent to the basement and forgotten. But careful had cost me years with a man who deserved directness, and I was 30 years old and a mountain had just moved, and I was done being careful. When the rescue team reached me, the first face I saw was not Theo's. It was a firefighter named Pascal whose headlamp was so bright it temporarily erased everything else. But the moment I was clear of the structure, the moment the open air hit my face and I was upright and breathing and taking my own inventory with the methodical efficiency of a physician assessing herself, ribs, yes, the grinding tell of a fracture, vision, slightly doubled, concussion likely, pain, considerable but manageable. In that moment I looked up and found him immediately. He was exactly where he had said he would be. I have thought about this many times since. The incident commander had told him to move back twice, and he had moved back the minimum distance required by the instruction and not 1 centimeter further, and he had stood in the exact position that maximized his line of sight to the extraction point, and he was covered in the fine gray dust of the mountain that had been settling on everything for hours, and his face was the specific face of a person who has spent 4 hours in a controlled and private catastrophe and has not permitted anyone to witness it. He crossed the perimeter. His arms came around me with extraordinary care. A surgeon's care, almost, the precise application of exactly enough pressure, the assessment in the gentleness of where I could and could not be held. I felt him breathe. That single long exhale, the setting down of something very heavy, the sound of a person returning from somewhere they do not wish to describe. I told you I'd find you. I pressed my forehead against his collarbone, and I felt the gray dust of the mountain on his coat and the warmth coming through it, and I thought about a 14-year-old boy sitting in a chair against an infirmary wall doing homework as if nothing unusual had occurred, and a carton of strawberry milk on a table, and 16 years of the same quiet, faithful grammar, and I said, into the fabric of his coat, into the dust, into the cold March air of the workers, something I had not said before, with sufficient plainness. I know you would always find me. He went very still for a moment. Then, quietly, yes. I want you to know that I know that, I said. Not as something I take for granted. As something I want to say plainly, out loud, so it's been said. His hand moved very carefully to the back of my head. Not pressing, just resting. Present. Okay, he said. I know. Around us the mountain exhaled its cold air, and the rescue workers moved with their equipment, and the gray dust settled on everything equally, indifferently, the way indifferent things do, making no distinction between the rubble and the living, between the broken structures and the people standing among them, between what had fallen and what remained. What remained was us, standing in the debris, covered in the same dust, breathing the same cold air. And I understood, with a clean precision of something confirmed rather than discovered, that the 4 hours under the mountain had not changed anything fundamental between us, had not created the love or invented the certainty, but had stripped away, with the same blunt efficiency with which the landslide had stripped away the hillside, everything that was not essential. What was left was this. He had driven 3 hours and stood in the dust and said I will find her, and meant it absolutely, and I had lain in the dark and thought of him with the same directness I gave to the things I valued most, and neither of us had performed any of it for anyone. That was the truth of it. Not borrowed. Not conditional. Not a transaction or a strategy or a reflection of someone else's light. Just the plain, difficult, durable thing itself. Just us, in the wreckage, breathing. Just sitting beside you in the dark, with tea, while you figure out what you need to write. I have been writing this for 3 months now. I began the night after the 9-hour surgery, at the kitchen table with the tea Theo had made going cold beside me, because something about that evening, the waiting room, the croissant, the strawberry milk, the 16 years contained in a small paper bag from a bakery on Rue du Faubourg Saint-Antoine, had loosened something in me that needed releasing. Not a knot, exactly. More like a held breath. The kind of breath you don't realize you have been holding until you finally let it out and feel the full depth of your own lungs for the first time. I am not a writer. I want to be clear about this. I am a surgeon, which means I have spent 15 years developing precision in my hands and my eyes and my capacity for sustained attention under pressure, and none of these skills transfer to the page as directly as one might hope. What I have instead is the habit of honest assessment, of looking at what is actually there rather than the version of it that is more comfortable to see, and it is this habit, more than any facility with language, that has carried me through these pages. What I have been trying to assess, across these 3 months and these 7 chapters, is something that resists the kind of clean conclusion I was trained to produce. In medicine, a case history ends with an outcome. The patient recovered, the patient did not, the intervention succeeded or failed. The assessment is followed by the conclusion, and the conclusion closes the case. I spent years learning to write in this form, to impose the architecture of resolution onto the always messier material of actual human bodies and their bewildering refusal to behave as simply as diagrams suggest. Life, I have found, does not close. What I have instead of a conclusion is this. An ordinary Tuesday in late spring, 3 weeks after I finished the last chapter of this account, which I had believed was finished. Theo had left early for a meeting and I was alone in the apartment we had spent the better part of the previous winter arranging around ourselves. Not decorating, exactly, but the slower and more intimate process of 2 people learning what they need from the space they share, where the quiet is comfortable and where it becomes suffocating, which objects matter and which can be released. The apartment had settled into something that felt genuinely inhabited rather than occupied, which is a distinction I understood only after experiencing it. I was drinking coffee at the window that looks down onto the courtyard. It was the hour when the light comes across the rooftops at an angle that turns everything briefly gold, the light that lasts perhaps 20 minutes before it resolves into ordinary morning, and I was watching it move across the cobblestones below with a specific quality of attention I can only access when I am not required to be anywhere yet. My phone was face down on the table. This is something I have been practicing, the deliberate placement of the phone face down, the refusal of constant availability, the protection of certain hours from the interrupted quality that has come to characterize most of modern life. Theo had suggested it 6 months earlier, gently and without pressure, the way he suggested most things, not as a correction of my behavior but as an offering of something he had found useful. Try it for a week, he had said. The world will still be there when you turn it back over. The world was, consistently, still there. I watched the light move across the courtyard and I thought about the basement in Marseille, which I think about still and probably always will. Not with the same weight as before. The weight has changed over the years, which is different from it disappearing, and I have come to understand this difference as important. Disappearing would be a kind of forgetting, and forgetting is a form of dishonesty, and I have committed myself to the more difficult and more valuable practice of carrying the past accurately rather than lightly. The basement is part of my formation. The closed door is part of why I became a doctor, part of why I recognize damage in its invisible forms, part of why I sat in an infirmary at 14 and understood something about gratitude and love that I would spend the next 16 years learning to apply correctly. I carry it, and I am not only it. This is the thing that took the longest to understand. There are mornings, not many, but honest ones, when I wake before Theo and lie in the early dark and feel the old architecture of my childhood self reassert itself with the stubborn persistence of a structure built on deep foundations. The sense of precariousness. The waiting for conditions to be withdrawn. The reflex to make myself smaller, less demanding, less likely to be a source of inconvenience to the people whose presence I value. These mornings have not disappeared. I do not believe they will disappear entirely, because the nervous system has its own long memory and does not respond to intellectual correction as quickly as one would prefer. What has changed is what I do with them. On those mornings I get up quietly and I go to the kitchen and I make tea, not coffee, tea, because tea is slower and requires more attention and the deliberateness of it is useful. And I sit at the table and I write in my notebook or I simply sit, and at some point, with the reliable consistency of tide, I hear the particular quality of Theo's silence moving through the apartment toward me. He never asks if I am all right in a way that requires reassurance for his own benefit. He never makes my sleeplessness into a concern that I then have to manage around his concern. He simply appears, in whatever I need him to be, present, quiet, tea-making, occasionally funny in the very dry way that still catches me off guard after all this time, and the morning becomes a different thing than it was before he entered it. I told him once, on one of those early mornings, about the church bells. About the basement floor and the counting, 9 and 10 and 11, the thin strip of light across my bare feet. I had not told this to anyone before, not in its full specificity, not with the smell of mildew and the particular quality of that dark. I told it to him the way I would document a case history, precisely, without editorializing, trusting the facts to carry their own weight, and he listened the way he always listened, completely, without rushing toward the part where he could say something that would make it better. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You counted to keep yourself company." It was not a question. It was a recognition. I had never thought of it in exactly those terms. I had thought of it as a coping mechanism, as a child's improvised management of an unbearable situation, as evidence of a kind of damage. But he had heard it as something else. A 7-year-old girl in the dark, doing the thing available to her, making sound and sense out of silence, keeping herself company with the only tools she had. Something in my chest shifted very quietly. "Yes," I said. "I suppose I was." "You were very resourceful," he said. Simply, without inflation, the way he said true things. I looked at him across the kitchen table in the early morning. There is a particular quality to the way he looks at me that I have been trying to describe accurately for 3 months and have not yet fully succeeded with. It is not adoration, which requires a distance between the person looking and the person seen, and which I have always found slightly uncomfortable, as if being adored means being placed on a surface too high for ordinary use. It is something more lateral than that. More like the way you look at something you know very well and find, still, genuinely interesting, the look of continued attention, of someone who has not stopped noticing you simply because they have learned your patterns. He looks at me like I am worth the continued effort of looking. After everything, after the basement and the absent father and the transactional mother and 5 years of a man who stopped seeing me so gradually that I almost didn't notice, after all of it, this is the thing that still moves me most. Not the grand gestures, not the ring beside the river, not the 3-hour drive and the 4 hours in the dust. Those things are true and I will carry them always. But it is this, the ordinary Tuesday morning, the tea, the way his eyes find mine across a kitchen table and do not look away, that I return to when I need to remember what I was looking for. I was looking for someone who would keep looking. I found him at 14, in a classroom in October, arguing over a seat by the window. I just needed 30 years to understand what I had found. Outside the window this morning, the courtyard light has moved past gold into the flat and serviceable brightness of an ordinary working day. I have a surgery in 2 hours. Theo has texted, a single sentence, no punctuation, characteristic. There is an almond croissant in the blue bag on the counter. It is from the good place, not the other one. I read it twice. I fold my notebook closed. I go to the counter and I find the blue bag, and inside is the almond croissant, still warm, from the good place. I eat it standing at the window, watching the courtyard. And I think, this is what the real thing looks like from the inside. Not borrowed. Not performed. Not the appearance of light. Just this. Just warmth in your hands. Just someone who remembers, without being asked, which bakery you prefer, and walks the extra distance, quietly, because to him, the difference between the good place and the other one is not a small thing when it is for you. It never was.